not Laverne and Shirley and MASH, Carol Burnett. This is when they were kids or not even born. This is the dawn of television. We're going to talk about the very beginning of television, but also the beginning of Atlanta television. And I will warn you, one of the things that we discovered as we started working on this was that there's not a lot of film. Television doesn't appreciate its history. And as a result, we don't have a lot to work with, but what we could find, a lot of what we could find, you're going to see it today. We're going to start with a clip just to kind of set it up and get in the mood. The clip is the very first Tonight Show, the first 30 seconds of the first Tonight Show, which over time became the most profitable television series in history. And one reason was because Steve Allen, who you're about to see, set up the economics of late night television where the biggest star made $130 to appear. That was it. You can plug your bit, but nobody gets a big talent fee to be on the Tonight Show. And then multiply that by 90 minutes a night times whatever, 18 minutes an hour of national commercials, and you have a formula for what television is all about and has always been about, and that's money. Television, if we're going to talk about the beginning of television, we got to spend 30 seconds talking about the beginning of radio. Radio, 1920, was chaos. There weren't frequencies assigned. If you wanted a radio station, you turned it on, you did it yourself, and hundreds of people did. And they were fighting with each other over the airwaves to try to be heard. Herbert Hoover, who later became president, 6 or 8 years later, headed the Federal Radio Commission, which was created to bring order to the chaos. Nobody knew what radio was going to be. Was it going to be commercial? Was it going to have entertainment shows? How were the stations going to be organized? What frequencies were they going to use, and what kind of power were they going to have? None of this had been worked out. In England, there we go. In England, radio and television were non-commercial. If you owned a radio, if you owned a television set, you paid a tax, and that was how they funded it. Were we going to do that? And so that was one of the first questions that had to be worked out in radio that later impacted television. Okay, we're going to give it a shot. These are the first 3 Atlanta TV stations, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But first, Steve Allen.
In case you're just joining us, this is Tonight. And I can't think of too much to tell you about it, except I want to give you the bad news first. This program is going to go on forever. Boy, you think you're tired now. Wait till you see 1 o'clock roll around. It's a long show. Goes on from 11:30 here in the East, that is, from 11:30 to 1 in the morning. And we especially selected this particular theater. This is a New York theater called the Hudson. And we especially selected this for this very late show because this theater's, I think it sleeps about 800 people.
The thing you couldn't hear was when he said this show is going to go on forever. And it was very prophetic because it does today remain one of the most popular shows in the world. Uniquely American. All right, so radio, we'll get back into that. Late 1920s, radio gets established. Mostly it was newspapers that bought radio stations. They had the capital, they had the content, they were interested in the experience, they felt threatened. And right around the same time, television began to bubble. Now remember, there's no transistors, there's no tubes, so television in the late 1920s, early 1930s was mechanical. This was what the sets looked like. They had a spinning disc that showed the flicker as little holes in the spinning disc, concentric circle. That was how you got your persistence of motion. And what you can see as you look at the screen, and this is an actual screen showing it, was how poor the resolution was. And one of the challenges now as we're trying to get television figured out, everybody wanted it. There was a great pent-up demand. One of the challenges of television was that There's so many moving pieces. How often does that screen refresh? What's the resolution on the screen? How many lines does it have? Does it use AM? Does it use FM? And there were different competing interests within the industries to try to have each company prevail, which we've seen many times since. To test the signal, RCA used Felix the cat because Felix could sit there for hours, and that's an actual Felix the cat shot from off the early monitor as mechanical television was being developed. It has to be said that television was rooted in RCA, and what you may not know, everybody heard of RCA? Yeah, what you may not know is how RCA came to be, and it has to do with the war. Britain was pulling ahead of the United States in television technology, and the US government was very worried about it. So they took the patents, all of the television-related patents owned by GE, AT&T, and Westinghouse, and pooled them into a company that would control television, RCA. And RCA then had the patents and the dollars and the resources, which they used very well to build early television. That's the good news. The bad news is they became horrible bullies at doing it. They wanted to prevail with their own standards, and there, of course, were other companies like Zenith, Dumont, that wanted to have a share of the pie. Ultimately, RCA killed FM radio for 20 years because they didn't have the patents for it. They had almost all of the patents for television. The government warned David Sarnoff, the head of RCA, even though they were ready to manufacture TV sets, do not market your sets to the public as the way it's going to be, because we don't know yet. David Sarnoff, having spent millions of dollars on this, said, to hell with you. And in April of 1939 at the World's Fair in New York, Sarnoff introduced television.
Today, we are on the eve of launching a new industry based on imagination, on scientific research and accomplishment. We are now ready to fulfill the promise made to the public last October when, after years of research, laboratory experiments, and tests in the field costing millions of dollars, the Radio Corporation of America announced that television program service and commercial television receivers would be made available to the public with the opening of the New York World's Fair.
That was broadcast in New York over Channel 1, which was the forerunner of WNBC. What's interesting, and this again goes back to the lack of appreciation for the historic nature of all this, that was a recreation. He sat at his desk and read it. Nobody filmed it. In fact, the event almost got knocked off the air because Franklin Roosevelt, the president's limo, drove over the cables as they were about to go on, and it knocked the signal off. So, 1939, RCA announces TV's here. They put the ads in New York papers because really at that point that's the only place where there was a TV station. And a few people bought the sets. The problem was that there were no standards still. So despite David Sarnoff's proclamation that you should borrow money and go out and get a set, there weren't a lot of shows. The standards weren't set. Channel 1 was the only one on the air really in New York with any regularity. And even though we were ready for television, World War II got in the way. So December 7th, 1941, Americans, no one in this room can imagine, you've heard it from your parents and your grandparents, what it was like to be in World War II and the degree to which the country had to focus its resources. Anyone who was working in television that was male got drafted. Any company that was manufacturing equipment that was used in television, well, that equipment was all given over to the war effort. And the television stations, if you could stay on the air during the war for an hour a week, the FCC allowed you to keep your license until after the war. They did. And the 1 hour a week were usually shows to help you in New York City prepare for what would happen if New York got bombed. So that was what it was. I mean, it was very primitive and great pent-up demand. So what do you do? And this goes all the way up till after the war, because there's still a ramp-up period when TV's got to get built. So what did Atlantans do every night for entertainment? They watched the radio. You're about to hear a clip from a radio show. We watched the radio. And I thought, just since so many years, this is what your grandparents did. They sit around and they watch the radio. This is a clip from Burns and Allen, George Burns, Gracie Allen. Gracie plays a ditz. She is not. She was really a very intelligent person. And Jack Benny, who always played a cheapskate and was not. And so they are at a fancy restaurant in Los Angeles. This is just a brief clip to break up me talking. Burns and Allen.
Oh, waiter, we're ready to order.
Yes, sir. Would Madame like to start with a cocktail?
Oh, no, thanks. I never drink.
I meant a shrimp cocktail.
No matter how small it is, I never drink.
Mrs. Burns will have a steak, and I'll have a broiled lobster. Well, they're both very good here, but as long as you're in the Brown Derby, you really should order the specialty of the house. You see, crackers and milk.
Oh, I've changed my mind. I won't have a steak.
Good.
I'll have lamb chops.
Madame will enjoy the lamb chops. We serve them with little paper panties on.
Well, don't your legs get cold?
So that's what Americans did for entertainment before television. But television was waiting in the wings, and television was ready to come on. This, most of the activity in the early days, 1948, 1949, came out of New York. NBC was the leading producer. This is the first commercial television studio. This is Studio 8G in Rockefeller Center. It is today used for the Seth Meyers Show. And they were building this thing with television in mind and ready to go, and began doing live broadcasts in the spring of 1948. Now, what about Atlanta? Well, the Atlanta Journal, the conservative afternoon newspaper, had dabbled in mechanical television in the early 1930s. They were always inventive. The Journal owned WSB Radio, which was the first radio station in the South. This was in their DNA. So they were committed to building a television station, WSB TV. And there were two other players, although the third one you've never heard of, didn't come along for a while. The two players were WSB and WAGA. WAGA was the CBS station. WSB was the longtime NBC station. So they took to the airwaves. It was very important in 1948 and 49. So if you put in your mind, you're 4 years after the war, television is about to take hold, there's great anticipation. And initially, there are 3 television stations in Atlanta. You think of WSB as Channel 2, they weren't, they were Channel 8. You think of WAGA as 5, they've always been there. And WCON, you've never heard of. CON was the Atlanta Constitution. That was the liberal morning paper that competed with the conservative afternoon paper. So again, newspapers had the financial wherewithal to start and operate a television station. Channel 5, WAGA, was owned, now it says Store, that's the company, those of you who lived in Atlanta a long time will remember. Before it was called Store, it was the Fort Industry Corporation, and they made gasoline additives. But they sold so much gasoline additive by advertising on radio and TV, they decided to buy radio and TV stations. And early on, they were allied with television program services. Keep in mind that the cable that delivered programs to the TV stations did not reach Atlanta until 1951. So that meant if you're a television station, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to do your own shows live with whatever you can cobble together for no money, or you're going to run very low quality prints of TV shows out of New York that were filmed off a monitor called a kinescope. And so the show was much better than anything that you could do, but the quality was so much worse. This is the story. I love this story because nobody knows it. Who's on first? What Atlanta TV station is going to hit the air first? And why is Toledo, Ohio up there? Well, again, very few people know this story, but the guy who turned on Channel 5 told me the story right before he died. He was 100 years old, their chief engineer. So Channel 5 would have been the first station on the air in Atlanta had everything gone according to plan. And who's ever first gets momentum. That's true in any business. Channel 5 was going to be on the air 3 months before WSB, and that was a real problem for WSB. But, not sure it'll go back, there. The guy who owned Channel 5, George Storer, also owned this station in Toledo, Ohio. That was where their company was based. And Toledo was as big as Atlanta. And in Toledo, it was the only station, no competition. In Atlanta, he was going to have to compete with Channel 2. So he decided, because you could not get equipment. Equipment was in very short supply because they were just starting to make it. RCA and GE were just getting into the business. George Storer ordered his chief engineer to send whatever equipment was necessary from down here in Atlanta to up there in Toledo so it could go on the air right away, which allowed WSB to sign on the air first. It's even better than that, though. The day that WSB signed on the air, September 26th, I believe, 1948. That afternoon, they're going to sign on in the evening. The governor's going to be there. It's a big party in the big studio that's about this size. It's going to be broadcast to about 1,000 people who have TV sets in Atlanta. It's a big deal. Television comes to the South. Their main tube blew. They're not going to get on the air. So their chief engineer called up WAGA's chief engineer and said, "Help, I need a tube." And the WAGA chief engineer said, "Okay." Engineers are like scientists, you know, they work together even if the countries are at war. Brought him the tube, plugged it in, WSB gets on the air. Word gets back to George Storer. "You did what?" And the engineer was officially reprimanded for communicating and cooperating with the enemy. All right, so let's go to it again. There's no film of the opening of Channel 2, of WSB, which actually was on Channel 8 back then. But we do have John Pruitt narrating The Next Best Thing, which is from their 60th anniversary special.
September 29th, 1948, WSB-TV goes on the air, the first television station in the South. After the welcomes and speeches, including one from His Honor, the primetime show began.
Good evening, everybody. To scan those headlines briefly.
On that big night, it was coverage you could count on.
During the day, the big three Western allies laid the Berlin crisis before the United Nations in Washington. The Department of Justice stepped in. On the Georgia political scene, the Senate today unanimously...
Newsman Jimmy Bridges brought Atlantans WSB's first newscast. Music and entertainment were next.
Hello, Dr. Rapino. Oh, you have your suitcase packed on.
Woody Willow and his Wooden Pals debuted.
Gee, Mr. Dunn, Jeffrey's up to his old trick.
Creators Don and Ruth Gilpin's dolls are cherished museum pieces now. But for 13 years on WSB, Woody and the gang were working stiffs.
I think that the most difficult part was trying to figure out what you're going to do tomorrow, because we were on 5 days a week.
In the beginning, there were few network programs and no syndicated shows, so stations like WSB produced their own programming.
During our first 4 years, we produced one of every kind of program that's on the air today.
And some of the hits weren't much different from what you see today, at least in concept. You're right, that is Dick Van Dyke. He was one of the many Merry Mutes, an ensemble of talent who performed in a weekly comedy show. There were home improvements and home shopping, live from Rich's.
So, Dick Van Dyke. Dick Van Dyke's first appearance on the air anywhere was WSB-TV's opening night in 1948. He is there on the left, standing up next to the piano player. And we'll talk about Dick Van Dyke in a minute, and actually one of Dick's good friends with a great story out of Augusta, who also started in TV. We'll do that in a minute. So it's Channel 2's on the air, pardon me, I keep saying that, WSB's on the air. Shortly thereafter, March of 1949, up comes their first competitor.
We've been here for 42 years so far, signed on Tuesday, March 8th, 1949, from a house on West Peachtree Street. The first show we were supposed to have was a movie called Conquest of the Sky, but the projector in the kitchen broke. Atlanta and Georgia and the world changed a lot since then, so has Wagon. Through Korea and Vietnam and Iraq, through Brown and the Board of Education and Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, through Willie B. Hartsfield and Ivan Allen and Sam Massell and Maynard Jackson and Andy Young and Maynard Jackson, and Wagon's brought it to your TV set, the good times and the bad. The ice storms and the Democratic Convention, getting the Olympics. Our folks have been there. Dale Clark, Paul Shields, Jim and John and Brenda, Judy Woodruff, Chuck Scarborough, Forrest Sawyer, Deborah Norval. Now we're in a building on Briarcliff Road that just looks like a house, and we're still broadcasting. Just hope the projector doesn't break.
Okay, we got 2 TV stations on the air. It's salad days. If you own a TV station, you are printing money in the basement. You are doing very, very well. And the government is about to screw you up. For 2 reasons. The government, of course, a lot of people wanted their own TV stations. And the government shut it down. At the end of 1948, the government said, if we haven't already given you permission to launch your station, hold off. And they brought television to a screeching halt. Supposed to be for 6 months. It was for 4 years. So if you lived outside of Atlanta, you read about television, you heard about Milton Berle, but you could not see it. There were 2 reasons for the freeze, as it was called. The first reason was CBS was trying to do its own version of color television that wasn't compatible with NBC's color, and they both had clout with the government, and it stopped the whole process of setting up TV stations. And the other one, not as big a factor in Atlanta as it was up north, they discovered that the signals were bouncing against each other if the frequencies were too close. So they had to figure it out. The technology that they thought was going to work didn't. I wanted to show you this. They did finally unthaw the freeze, and within 6 months, every city in Georgia got a television station. That was in 1954. But I thought you'd be interested in this. This is a little bit later on. This is the very first color videotaped show. We'll play about 30 seconds of it. This is Fred Astaire.
Ladies and gentlemen, the following program is being brought to you in living color on NBC. Chrysler Corporation, makers of Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, Chrysler, and Imperial. The Forward Look 59 presents An Evening with Fred Astaire. Jones Quartet, David Rose and his orchestra, and introducing Miss Mary Chase.
That was big stuff. Things don't always work out. Channel 2, Channel 5, there we go again. WSB, Channel 8, and Channel 5 did very, very well for their companies. And they became major companies as they hemorrhaged profit. But there were a lot of entrepreneurs that wanted to get into television in Georgia, and they couldn't do it. They went broke. And there's a couple of interesting stories about those folks, little known. So we had the freeze that I told you about. One reason that the winners made so much money and the losers lost so much money was because of scarcity. There were only 12 channels. I mentioned Channel 1, WNBC, back in the early 40s. What happened to Channel 1? In 1946, anybody here from Washington, D.C. or have experience in the Washington, D.C. market? Okay, Fox 5 is WTTG. TTG is Thomas T. Goldsmith, and Thomas T. Goldsmith is responsible for the fact that we do not have a Channel 1. So we're early in television. This was a big problem, New York, Washington, where the police and fire departments were using television frequencies, the FM frequencies, to communicate with each other. And whenever a policeman would come on near your television set, you'd hear the policeman while you were watching Milton Berle. So Goldsmith came up with the idea at the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers and said, let's give them Channel 1. And everybody on that phone call agreed they would propose it, and it was approved, and that's why there's no Channel 1. So scarcity. There are only 12 channels available anywhere in the country, and what they discovered during the freeze was there had to be 270 miles between the channels. So it immediately made scarcity an issue. The commission, FCC, decided that it worked in radio, it'll work in television. Let's add channels. Now this was primitive technology. UHF waves travel much faster than the lower channel waves. They're impacted by leaves on trees, by buildings. It takes an enormous amount of power to get a signal out. But again, we got entrepreneurs out there who are looking at how much WSB is making and they want to do it themselves. So the commission set up UHF stations, frequencies available all over the country. Little towns like, well, Cedartown had one. Claxton, Atlanta wound up with lots more channels, some of them in the UHF band. And so this became a gold rush in 1954. We're gonna make a lot of money. We're gonna go into UHF. The problem was, this is a fairly good representation out of Kansas City of what signal looked like under the best circumstances. And there were only 3 networks. So what are you gonna show? All the good stuff's already on the stations that you can receive, and the TV sets of the day did not include UHF tuners. That didn't slow people down. This is Macon. This is actually before Channel 13 went on the air in Macon. And the interesting story about this station, WETV, is that it was, I don't want to oversell it, it was groundbreaking. 2 radio stations in Macon who competed with each other and had been bitter enemies decided to team up and start a television station and split the profit. So, strange bedfellows. Could they do it? Or is it collusion? They went to the FCC, and after a few months, the commission ruled, you can do it, but no one who works at the radio station can work at the television station. And so they lasted 9 months. Same thing happened here. This is rare. Very few people have ever heard of this station. Channel 11 was WQXI in the late 60s. But this is before that. This is 1954, when the owners of WQXI Radio decided to try their hand at television. They owned 1 camera. They focused on the disc jockey playing records. 9 months. You didn't have to be a UHF station to fail. Rome put on Channel 9. It was ideal. Great channel number, tremendous frequency, reasonably good power. The reason that you'll see Channel 8, or WSB was Channel 8 and moved to Channel 2, another station came on Channel 8, interfered with Channel 9 and moved to 11, and that's why it's 11 Alive today. It was originally on 8. At any rate, Rome, Georgia. What they learned in Rome was that running a television station was an extremely expensive endeavor, and Rome's a little town. So the owner of the station tried his best. This is a guy in his 30s, tried his best to get the FCC to allow him to move Channel 9 to Chattanooga. Much bigger market, more ad dollars, better potential for success. In the meantime, and this went on for 5 years, the poor guy is trying to keep the station on the air because if he turns it off, he loses it. And it was horrific stress. On the night before the commission granted him permission to move the station, he died of a heart attack. I mentioned, so real quickly, Channel 8 in Atlanta. Right now, Channel 8 is GPTV. There are technical reasons for that. But in the early days, Channel 8 was a commercial frequency. First, WSB, which bought the Constitution. In those days, Channel 2 was a better signal than Channel 8, so they moved, opening this up. And this was another interesting station because it was, I keep talking about your neck of the woods, Shay. An investor in Rockmart and the president of Davison's department stores bought Channel 8, tried to put it on a shoestring and lost their shirt and had to sell it in a distress sale about a year later. So that's the history of Atlanta's Channel 8. We're getting close to the end. The next thing I'll do is tell you a couple of stories about some personalities, but first I want to spend just a minute here because this is what got me interested in TV. Late 40s, early 50s, there were 4 networks. NBC, which was owned by RCA, CBS, which came from CBS Radio, was independent, ABC, which came from the Lifesavers Candy Company, and this 4th network, which was the Danny DeVito of TV networks. They really tried. And for a while, it looked like they were going to make it, and ABC wasn't. Dumont was carried here on Channel 5. It's where Jackie Gleason made his television debut as in The Honeymooners. They struggled. This is a rare clip.
This is the home of professional football, the Dumont Television Network.
And yes, they had the NFL games. And they still failed. In 1955, Dumont folded. Today, almost the exact same stations are the Fox network. Okay, finally, 3 stories about personalities. The first one you heard about, Dick Van Dyke hosted a show first on WSB and then on what was Channel 8. And here's your interesting story. When he was at WSB, what you had to do basically was fill time. And he would put on a record and mime it on camera, filling time. So one day, and this is not White Columns, the old WSB building, this is before that, he is on the air miming an Andy Griffith comedy bit. People didn't really know who Andy Griffith was, didn't have a TV show. But he's standing there and he's miming the bit on camera and he looks over and Andy Griffith is standing right there. Now what's the rest of the story? Fast forward to the early 1960s, the Dick Van Dyke Show and the Andy Griffith Show are both produced by the same company with Sheldon Leonard. Next one. I love this story. This is Jim Nabors, right? Gomer. Jim Nabors was in his car moving from Virginia or whatever, came through Augusta, knew someone who worked at WJBF TV, Channel 6, which had just signed on the air, J.B. Fuqua, and applied for a job and got it. Not on the air. He was essentially a switcher. So this would be 1956, 55, somewhere around there. On a Sunday morning, they had Jim as the sole employee on duty at the station. He had to sign it on. He had to play the films and give the station IDs. Not a lot of money was involved. You don't sell a lot of commercials on Sunday morning, so whatever. And he went to put on a show called The Big Picture. The Big Picture was an Army show that was free to TV stations that included footage of World War II and basically sold the Army. And it was free programming. So Jim gets the big film out and puts it on the projector, and at 10 o'clock hits play, and up comes the show. And he goes on now and starts getting ready for whatever is going to air at 10:30. When the phone rings, and they had several lines, and all of a sudden all 4 lines are ringing. It was odd. Probably didn't think there were 4 viewers. Picked up the first line, and he said, there's an elderly woman, and she said, "I've never seen anything like that on TV before." And he turned around and he looked. It was a venereal disease film with full frontal male nudity. Never forget it. Finally, I want to talk about a local guy who I think a lot of. He's also in the Georgia Hall of Fame. I competed against him in an earlier life. Does anybody know Don Kennedy? Popeye Club? Okay, so it was about the hottest show, kid show in the country. It was on every afternoon on WSB. They played Popeye cartoons. They had kids in every afternoon in the peanut gallery, and they played games. And I thought we would watch this. This will bring back a memory for you, and I'll tell you why they did it in case you don't know.
I will use the alternating method to begin the cartoon. I'll say 5 and you say 4. I'll say 3 and you say 2. I'll say 1 and you say 0, and the cartoon should start. Here we go. 5! Whoops, wait a minute. 3! Excellent, outstanding, very good. 1!
Anybody know why they did that? Pre-roll. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up with 2 slides that are not consistent with anything else that I've done, but one brings back a lot of memories. And for those of you who had cable early, my parents were not early adopters. I don't know why we had it, but we did. This is what cable was. Cable was a good way to get a clear signal on the 3 Atlanta TV stations. And this was in Atlanta. Did anybody have cable in Atlanta in the late 60s, early 60s, whatever? This is what it was. There was no HBO, there was no TBS. These dials rotated, black and white, low-res camera, back and forth, and that was cable. And it was cable for a long time. Until my second slide. How many people here are from Turner? Anybody? How many people are familiar with Turner? All right. I wanted to show you something that is unique. Everybody's got to come from somewhere. Turner is a multi-billion-dollar worldwide conglomerate. But it started on September 17th, 1967. It was a shoestring operation owned by a man named John Rice Jr., JRJ. And it was such a ragtag operation, they couldn't get 3 things in a row correctly. The slides were upside down and backward. I mean, I was fascinated watching this thing unfold. Film broke. It was a catastrophe. And it lost massive amounts of money until Ted Turner bought it in 1968. They could afford to run 1 ad in their entire history as WJRJ in TV Guide magazine, and that was the day that they signed on the air. And that is the ad. That is CNN, TBS, TNT, cartoon, started right there. We all got to start from somewhere. So there you have it. That's the history of television as it appears to be for me. I hope you enjoyed it.
I had the great fortune of, prior to doing the the event, Richard and I went and had lunch at Brio, and I was so intrigued with his stories, I went home and I Googled early broadcast in Georgia, and I came across an eBay listing that I subsequently put a lowball bid on, and it was for a radio and TV station guide for Georgia State of Adventure, Tune In While You Travel. And these were distributed in the gas stations, evidently, and people could unfold a map and look at what TV stations and radio stations. So just as a small token of our appreciation, thank you so much.
Nice job.
Thank you. Really good.